Good morning. I'm George LeMieux, and I have the privilege of being the chairman of the board of the Gunster Law Firm. On behalf of Bill Perry, our managing shareholder, our board of directors, and all of the more than 450 team members here at the Gunster Law Firm, welcome to this post-election webinar, where we will break down the issues specifically impacting Florida from Tuesday's election. Now, we are recording this webinar. You can view a replay on demand at our Gunster website at gunster.com. It will be posted tomorrow morning, and we encourage you to share it with others. You can find additional timely information on that website as well. We have lots of informative webinars, postings, white papers on the pandemic, as well as issues impacting Florida as we come to the end of 2020. If you have any questions, I encourage you to submit them using the Q&A feature that you see on your screen. We will sort those questions out, and we will not identify you by name. They will be done anonymously, and we'll make sure we get the question to the right person to answer it for you. Today, I'm privileged to introduce and feature our experienced governmental affairs teams that will analyze the outcome of the election across the state, including key legislative races, and they also provide insight on what the results mean for the state of Florida and some of the federal outcomes. We'll also talk about the constitutional amendments that were on the ballot and the passage of some of those amendments and what it means to the people of Florida. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, and then we will hear from each one of them. After that is done, we'll have a question and answer session, and we want you to provide those questions again in the Q&A box that you see there on your screen. First, let me introduce to you my colleague and the chair of our Gunster's Governmental Affairs and Lobbying Team. It's former State Representative Ron Brisé. Ron has a wealth of experience in governmental, legislative, political, and business arenas, including the appropriations process, education, government, public policy, and economic development. He is an accomplished legislative leader. He was elected to the Florida House of Representatives at the age of 32 during 2006. And during his time in the legislature, Ron was designated the Democratic whip and served as the vice chair of the Florida Conference of Black State Legislators. Following his time in the legislature, his public service didn't stop. He was appointed to serve on Florida's Public Service Commission, which regulates all utilities in the state of Florida. So he adds a wealth of experience from both the regulatory role as well as the legislative role. The next person I would like to introduce is Joanna Bonfanti. Joanna is a seventh generation Floridian, which is about as many generations as you can have in Florida. She is from the Panhandle of our state, the great northwestern portion. She has deep roots in the state and the political process because her father, former Senator Charlie Cleary, served 10 years in the Florida Senate. Joanna has worked for the past 15 years representing clients before legislature and executive agencies, and her clients are in a variety of industries from energy, transportation, water, wastewater, regulated industries, gaming, nonprofit corporations, environmental healthcare, and education. Our next panelist on the Gunster team is Kevin Cleary. He's a native of our capital city, and he's skilled in navigating the inner workings of government. Prior to joining Gunster, Kevin developed more than a decade of legislative, executive, and political experience serving in the government. Most recently, he served as the Legislative Affairs Director at the Department of Environmental Protection, where he advocated for the governor's legislative priorities. He's also worked in the Florida legislature for various members of the Florida legislature and knows that process intricately. Combined with his knowledge of the executive branch, Kevin brings a wide toolbox full of tools to be able to help our clients in the Florida government process. Finally, I want to introduce Julie Fess. She has more than 2 decades of experience in Florida's political, regulatory, and legislative process. She supports our public policy and advocacy clients in Tallahassee and around the state. She began her career in Central Florida, working in the Florida House of Representatives, and then as a senior legislative assistant for Senate Budget Chairman and later Majority Leader Locke Burt of Volusia County. She was involved in shaping numerous issues and shepherding numerous issues through the legislative process in that role. She also served as the chief legislative assistant for Speaker of the Florida House and a key policy advisor and liaison with government and community groups. She also advocates on behalf of our clients in the Florida legislative process. So without any further ado, let me turn things over to the chair of our governmental affairs practice, Ron Brisé, who will give an overview of the presidential election and the impacts here in Florida.
Thank you, Senator LeMieux, and it's great to join you and our colleagues here for this great conversation. Who would have thought that we would be at this juncture today? Actually, we probably all did, in terms of those of us who are paying close attention to the elections and the trends that were leading up to the election here in Florida. You know, Tuesday was an exciting day here in Florida for a few reasons. Over 11 million people voted in Florida, and that's a great thing for democracy. We had about 76.9% turnout in our state. So that says a lot about the energy and enthusiasm that folk across our state had for their candidates, and to see and to voice their opinion as to what is important to them for the forward movement of our state. So turning to the presidential race, the president gained 5.6 million votes in the state of Florida. And that's quite a lot of votes here in this state. And that's much higher than in many past elections. And Vice President Biden got 5.2 million votes in the state of Florida. There's a couple of things that were interesting about the race and turnout. Certain parts of the state underperformed for the Democrats. If you think about South Florida, particularly Miami-Dade, some will say that the turnout was anemic for the Democrats in South Florida. President Trump overperformed in Miami-Dade County, particularly with the Hispanic community. And if we go deeper into that, particularly with the Cuban community and the Venezuelan community down in South Florida. So there were a lot of things on the table that were of interest to all of the community groups across our state. Now, it's interesting that every election, particularly when we think about presidential elections, you think about your state vis-a-vis who's going to be in the White House. We know that our current governor, Governor DeSantis, has a close relationship with President Trump. And so if there's a change in the White House, we wonder what type of impact that's going to have in terms of the relationship between the governor and the president, if it ends out to be President Biden in the White House. But Florida has a strong congressional delegation and will get its needs met that way. Talking about the congressional delegation, Florida lost there was a switch of hands, rather, in two seats in the congressional districts. So you had two congressional districts in South Florida that went from Democrat to Republican. So two pickups for Republicans in the House of Representatives at the federal level. At the Senate level, in the state Senate, the Senate picked up a couple of seats themselves, or maintained their majority. And there's a seat, the seat District 37, that is wire thin in terms of the gap, 21 votes difference at this point. So that's going to a natural recount. And so there's a good chance that the Republicans pick up that seat and move the majority even to a stronger position in the Senate. On the House side, the Florida House, there were 5 seats that changed hands. And so you had 5 pickups for House Republicans in the Florida House. So the Republicans ran a very strong operation in this election cycle. And it seems that Floridians are very pleased with the way that the state, at the very least, is running currently, and so therefore they showed that through their votes in this election. So, from a policy perspective, there's probably not going to be much change, considering that there isn't a lot of change from the leadership or the membership of each chamber of the legislature. And we trust that the same level of enthusiasm that people showed in the election, that they maintain that level of enthusiasm and remain engaged in the process by keeping in contact with their members of the legislature and so forth. So with that, I will turn it back to you, George, so that we can hear from our other colleagues.
Thank you so much, Representative Brisé. Really interesting outcome that no one anticipated. The polls before the election were showing, most of them were showing Vice President Biden with a narrow lead here in Florida. But, you know, one thing I like to remind people is that pollsters don't just randomly call 600 people and say, who are you voting for? They build models, and those models have assumptions. They have assumptions about turnout, who will turn out, and what the race will be like. And they look backwards at previous races, the gubernatorial election of 2 years ago, the presidential election of 4 years ago, and they build these models. And for the most part, just like last election, the models were wrong. And we had this high intensity vote for Republicans, especially in Southeast Florida. Hillary Clinton looking like she outperformed Joe Biden by as much as 300,000 votes in Southeast Florida. Interesting point, though, Ron, is that Jacksonville voted for Vice President Biden, and that has not happened in a presidential election, I think, all the way back to Jimmy Carter. So last gubernatorial election, Andrew Gillum won Jacksonville, but many people thought that that was because the large black population in Jacksonville identified with Mayor Gillum and voted for him, and that it might have been an anomaly. But it looks like, Ron, that might be a trend that Republicans have to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. I think that, and Kevin might get into this a little bit more, but there are true demographic shifts that are happening within the state, and it might be a reflection of mobility within the state. And so you may have people that are moving from certain parts of the state to other parts of the state, and then shifting the equilibrium of where people are voting and ultimately outcomes in some of these races.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And that's a great segue to turn things over to Kevin, who's going to talk to us about voter turnout and numbers across the state, how much money was spent in the state on these elections, and some election trends in Florida. So let me turn it over to Kevin Cleary.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. And you are correct. Both you and Representative Brisé is correct. This has been an amazing election cycle. It has had a lot of surprises. And I believe it's also going to start changing some of the conventional thinking that's taken place here in Florida. Just to talk about the Northeast Florida region, conventional thinking back a few years back, as early as 2008, was if you won a conservative vote for Northeast Florida, a margin of 50 to 60,000 votes, you could make up the difference of lost votes for Republicans down in Miami-Dade, Broward County area. As you can see from this election cycle, that has gone out of the typical norm of thinking, and maybe Northeast Florida won't be the anchor for the Republicans as it was before. And to your point, Senator LeMieux, the 300,000 vote deficit from 2016 election of Hispanic voters in Miami-Dade, specifically Cuban American, had a significant impact on this race, and it had a significant impact down the ballot for the state Senate and for the House of Representatives. As Representative Brisé mentioned, the House Republicans flipped 5 seats. That now puts them at 78 to 42, and it is almost a supermajority. We have not seen that in many, many years. And the turnout, with the conventional thinking is the more voters that turn out, the better Democrats could potentially do in a state. As you can see, the turnout was unbelievable. I believe the last time we saw a turnout as large as this was in 1980. And the turnout, though, was very well done for both Republicans and Democrats. I think one of the voting trends that was the most shocking, at least for me, was conventionally thinking absentee ballots was usually the stronghold for the Republican Party of Florida. Early voting was a stronghold for the Democratic Party, and everyone battled it out on Election Day. This year completely flipped upside down. The amount of early voting that conservatives came in Election Day vote is something that we should be watching moving forward. That will this be the strategy moving forward? The Democrats since 2008 have done an amazing job building their absentee ballot voter base. It has allowed them to track their voters in a better manner and to stay on top of turnout, because they do register more lower propensity or less frequent voters. And that is something that is going to be very important for the Democratic Party to think about moving into the next gubernatorial race and the next presidential race here in Florida. Another item I think that is very important is understanding the I-4 corridor and realizing that with Pinellas and Hillsborough, even with them turning blue and some of the larger populations of voter registrations turning blue, rural Florida had a significant impact. And that is something where the I-4 corridor may not carry the same weight in Florida as it has in previous decades. So it'll be very interesting to see. Another aspect that was very interesting this year was the amount of money spent on both sides. It was amazing. It obviously showed as far as turnout, but as a lot of folks I'm sure are wondering, where is the polling on this and why was everything so off? One of the big items I think you're going to start seeing in the next future election cycles is a true thought process on how exactly are we going to target voters, identify those voters, and then chase those voters on the election timeframe, whether it's absentee, early vote, or election day. The polling is going to be critical in that. You will not stop seeing polling, but you may see the methodology used dramatically change. One of the big items you may start seeing is, as Senator LeMieux referenced, when you do polling, you typically, because of your margin of error, are around 500-600 calls, and you try to identify that, and then you weight your scale to represent the entire state. Social statistics would tell you that you cannot have a qualified number until you get up to 1,000 or 1,500. You may start seeing that now. You may start seeing those calls that I'm sure everyone on this webinar received. Those questions may be smaller and a less amount, and you may start to get a lot more automated calling. One of the thought processes in polling was dealing with having live callers call voters so that you could have a better determination of exactly what the voter was thinking or feeling. One of the things I think has been a revelation in the last few years is with technology and with automated calling and also digital media and digital information, you can capture a lot of that without having a voter be concerned about what way they think from the caller on the other line. So you are going to start seeing some new ways that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are going to target ID voters and track them and then advocate for their turnout on GOTV or get out the vote time frame. And then lastly, one of the big items I think you'll notice as well is that we had a record amount of fundraising for both parties. I believe that that's not going to change. Even with technology and the ability to get your message out on a cheaper, faster method than conventional mail or TV, it is going to still be a critical amount of money to be able to get your voice heard and to make sure that your voters know who you are. With the amount of information that everyone has at their fingertips on their cell phones, you have to be able to get into that phone and use digital media, and that will continue to cost money. And I think lastly, one of the most important things to take away from this is realizing how exactly will both parties put the money they raise moving forward. As you can see, there was a lot of money spent, but not a lot of money or not a lot of opportunity gained for some of these races. It's going to be a gut check time for both parties to think about how exactly are we going to target Florida and our demographics here in the state, knowing that South Florida changed the election for President Trump this year, and Northeast Florida, the Panhandle and I-4 corridor may have a different weight moving forward than you've seen in the previous years. Thank you very much. I turn it back to you, Senator.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's great analysis. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think we're going to find out that the Biden campaign and the Biden, what I would call surrogate groups, whether that's Bloomberg or other political action committees, far outspent President Trump and his supporting groups here in the state of Florida. So, you know, and most of that money is spent on television, and you wonder the advocacy value of TV in, you know, a social media world. So fascinating things for us to look at. The money just keeps going up and up every election. And also, too, that ability on social media to raise money. I mean, we saw this around the country where Lindsey Graham's opponent in South Carolina raised $57 million, you know, in the third quarter, which I like to joke you could buy everybody a car in South Carolina for that much money. So, you know, it's social media is transformed fundraising, it's transformed campaigning, it's transformed our lives, and certainly that's going to continue. And you mentioned, Kevin, the I-4 corridor, and that gives me a nice transition to introduce again Julie Fess, because she's a specialist in that area. She's going to tell us about the I-4 corridor and also about Senate District 9, which is of importance in this election, and also the constitutional amendments that passed and didn't pass. So let me turn things over to Julie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I wanted to kind of start off and talk a little bit about how COVID impacted the grassroots campaign, and then I'll segue into the Central Florida and then the amendments. But I want to talk a little bit about how COVID affected everything this year. And, you know, as a lobbyist, governmental relations person, during the summers and the campaign years, that's what we do. We go out and we walk and we help, you know, the candidates and, you know, build relationships. And this year was very different. You know, we got out of session in March, and usually that's when you start hitting the pavement and the candidates get out there and start, you know, walking neighborhoods and doing stuff. This year was very different. They could not do that. So I talked to many candidates. We're like, you know, we have our hands tied. We can't really do anything. We're making phone calls. We're doing direct mail, but it was even, you know, early for that. As the summer moved on, they started walking, and you had, when you went up to people's doors, it was funny. You either had the ones that really wanted to talk to you because they were quarantined for so long and just, it was finally someone to speak to, or you had the people that were just pushing back. No, I don't want, you know, don't come to my door. But as the summer moved on, people were better about allowing folks to come and talk to them and dropping off brochures. And I think you saw that go back the way it was a little bit. So the grassroots, but I still think that grassroots campaigning is the best in the local and state government. I mean, people want to see these candidates come to their doors. They want to see them in public. They want to see their families. And I think that COVID really did change that in the beginning of the summer. So it did have an impact on how some of these campaigns played out. Anyway, I wanted to move into the Central Florida. So it was interesting to me, Central Florida and my little county of Seminole here that I live in made national news this year. And I wanted to, I think it was Senator LeMieux or maybe it was Kevin that talked about the rural communities. And for so long, Seminole County was a rural community. And, you know, it was a bedroom community of Orlando. But as time has gone on, and because of our city and bringing people here and our great schools, we have a lot of big businesses here. So our county is not as rural as it used to be. So it has been since 1948, Herbert Hoover, since Seminole County has elected or voted for a Republican or a Democratic president. That is incredible. I mean, we went from like very, very, very red to being purple, and now I think we're blue. But with that being said, it was interesting, although Biden did win Seminole County, one of the biggest races in Florida was Senate District 9. Senator Broder now, or Senator-elect Broder, and Patricia Sigmund. And that was a big, big race in the state of Florida. There were two races that were big. It was Senate District 38 and Senate District 9. And Broder's numbers in the beginning had him losing to Sigmund. And we were all very concerned how this was going to play out. And one of the things that I noticed through the polling was the internal polling, the polling that the candidates were doing and the party was doing was pretty accurate. When I was talking to folks and then after the election, they were all very, very accurate. I think that voters were much more willing to tell pollsters who they were voting for in the state elections, but not so much in the presidential elections. So although we were very concerned about some of these races, especially here in Central Florida, they ended up being fine. I mean, although Biden won it, it didn't have that trickle-down effect that everybody was so afraid of. Everybody kept talking about, that there was a lot of concern about if Biden was by 3 points or if Biden was by 5, it would have a big impact on some of these races. And what I think is wonderful about that is I think voters are doing their homework. I think they are looking at this, and yes, they may have been disgruntled with their presidential candidates or their president, but they were actually going down and doing their homework on who some of these other candidates are. I don't think there was any of the incumbents, and these are Democrats too, in the Central Florida area that were not reelected. I think that all the Central Florida candidates were reelected. Central Florida incumbents, were reelected. But anyway, it was just an amazing race. The I-4 corridor, what used to be considered a very Republican stronghold, has changed dramatically. I mean, Orange County, although it has been a lot more blue over the years, you're seeing other counties around here going, more Democratic. So that's been interesting. Let's talk about that. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit too about the constitutional amendments, and I'm going to kind of play these with Joanna as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then Joanna can go. Amendment 1, the citizenship required to vote. That was just an outstanding. That was 79.3%, and that was the legislature actually put that amendment on the ballot. And the reason behind that was because right now that is already in statute, but they wanted something in the Constitution that could not be changed. This amendment provides that only United States citizen, 18 years of age, and permanent resident vote. So that was a 79.3 was an amazing outcome on that. The second one was the raising of the Florida minimum wage. There was a big push in the end on this constitutional amendment by some of the parks, Disney, and other big employers around here to try to defeat this kind of, behind the scenes. But at the end, John Morgan put a lot of money into this. And as you see, it won by 60.8%. It was very close. It's funny, I was just reading something that came in on the news clips, and John Morgan said today that he was not going to do any more constitutional amendments, back any more constitutional amendments. So that's a good thing, I guess. I don't know. Amendment 3, this was the voters in primary election, the governor and cabinet. Yeah, this is one that a big political donor for the Republican Party actually pushed, and he was a little disgruntled with both parties, I believe, and it was just going to allow everybody to go in the primary elections, allows registered voters to vote in primary for the governor and all. But anyway, I don't know that. Sorry. Number 4 was the constitutional amendment that the ballot summary. This was one that was actually supported by the chamber, and the chamber pushed really hard for this one. And I think we're going to see this one come back.
Julie, that's the one that is the requiring 2 votes to pass something in the Constitution.
Right. And I think you're going to see this one come back. This is to keep our Constitution clean, and I think there's a lot of push for that. And it got 47.5, and I was kind of surprised. And the last 2 were the homestead exemption ones, and you're going to always see these pass. But anyway, I think that's about it, and I will turn it back to you, Senator LeMieux.
Thank you, Julie. Amazing in a state. I mean, think about this, and what does this mean for politics in Florida is that Donald Trump wins the state by 400,000 votes, And at the same time, more than 60% of Floridians vote to raise the minimum wage. Now, there was a time when Republicans were viewed as sort of the party of business, and most businesses, as Julie was saying, maybe some of the big employers in Central Florida were against raising the minimum wage because it's more money out of their pocket. But at the same time that we're electing Donald Trump in Florida, where 60% of us or more are voting to raise the minimum wage from $8 an hour to $15 an hour. So that just kind of tells you about the remaking of politics in this country. Donald Trump is really focused on workers. He's really transformed the Republican Party, in my view, into a workers' party. When you see him being tough on China and trying to bring jobs back, when you see him being tough on immigration to keep immigrants from coming in so there's more jobs for Americans, that has been a consistent thematic. And that is identified, people in this country have identified with that thematic. So it's not inconsistent anymore for a Republican to win and then a minimum wage vote to also pass. So very different times here in Florida. The poor performance on the Keep Our Constitution Clean amendment, I do think the business community will be back at it, but I don't think, they're so far away with a 40-some% approval. That's going to be tough sledding for them. I think the people of Florida are going to need some more education on that before they're willing to lend 60% of their support to it. Let me turn things now over to Joanna Bonfanti. Joanna is going to talk to us about the great Northwest Florida and some other constitutional amendment issues and what the rest of this means for the impacts on Florida after Tuesday's election. Joanna?
Thank you, George. So over here in the Panhandle, we certainly saw a continued trend of Republican voters turning out for their candidates. We re-elected a number of Republican incumbents, from President Trump all the way down to local office holders here in the State House and Senate. Just a few highlights on some of those races. Alex Andrade, J.R. Williamson, Jay Trumbull, and Senator Doug Broxton all won their races to be reelected. All Republicans spanning from Perdido Key down to Panama City area. So those folks will be back in Tallahassee representing the good people of the Panhandle. We do have a new member of the House of Representatives, a former judge, Pat Maney. He was elected to fill Representative Mel Ponder's seat when Representative Ponder decided he wanted to run for local office here in Okaloosa County. So Representative Maney will be representing District 4 now in the State House. There was one Republican candidate who lost his race that probably is worth noting here in the Panhandle. He lost in the primaries, so some of you may recall this news, but that was Mike Hill. He was the only Panhandle incumbent to lose, and he previously represented District 1. He lost to Representative now Michelle Salzman, and she went on to win her general election matchup pretty handily. So I think one of the things that you see here in the Panhandle, there's always a lot of folks that get worried that if they start reporting the vote counts too early on election day in Florida, because we're in a different time zone, and if folks see what those numbers are and they haven't gone to vote yet, or if they're in line to vote and they feel as though it might be a little bit helpless for whomever their particular candidate might be, they might just opt out of the voting that day. So I know that there's typically a concern about that. The media speculate about it a good bit, but what you see here is very consistent, high turnout by especially Republican supervoters, and especially on the day of election. That seems to be the time that folks like to get out. It doesn't seem as though the COVID concerns kept people away here, but I will note that there were a few districts where you did see a little bit of an increase in Democratic voters turning out. So that's kind of the highlights on the Panhandle races. I will take note of one Big Bend race that had particular emphasis and attention shown to it from the Senate leadership. That would be the race between Marva Preston and Loran Osley, Representative Loran Osley. They were running for Senator Montford's seat, who had turned out, and Representative Osley is a Democrat. Marva is a Republican, African-American female, and it was a quite interesting race. There was a lot of money spent in that race by the Senate leadership, hoping to possibly flip that seat to a Republican seat and further cement their control of the upper chamber. That did not happen. Representative Osley won her seat. I think the race was probably closer than it could have been because of the amount of time and energy and money, and then just the quality of the candidate that Ms. Marva was. She certainly was one of the best candidates they've put forward in that Big Bend area for a Republican voter to turn out for. So those are the notes I have on races. In terms of the amendments, I think really the amendment that drew the most emphasis, the most attention, certainly was Amendment 2, and that is really going to impact our service industry, especially over here in the Panhandle. We're very largely military base type economy, but we have a tremendous service economy. And, you know, a lot of the hotel, lodging, restaurant, entertainment type folks had tried to educate the local voters as to why, although it sounds like a good idea to help folks earn more money, you know, for these hourly wage type positions, it can be quite devastating to the employer's ability to actually pay folks. And so, you know, one of the questions that I think we'll learn more about is this going to impact folks who work for types of jobs where you receive tips as a large part of your compensation, and will employers do away with those types of systems and go to a more straight, you know, hourly wage base, which will impact people's ability to bring good pay home. So that's an interesting question. I also know that Speaker Designate Sprouse has mentioned that the legislature will be looking closely at that amendment in particular to see if there is anything the legislature could do to potentially impact that amendment and its implementation. So that'll be an interesting question to look at going forward. And I think now, Senator, we can turn it back over to you so we can get into some of these great questions we're getting in.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanna. Yeah, I think that's something that I'd like to have you just speak a little bit more about, is that when you pass a constitutional amendment, it's not just the end of the process. The legislature then takes some action. Can you talk a little bit about what the legislature does after a constitutional amendment passes?
Absolutely. The legislature does have a role in the implementation of these amendments. And so they will go forward and actually enact the statutes that will help to bring about the framework for how some of these matters will work in our state laws. If anyone else has anything to add there, I'd certainly defer. But I think that's the way that the legislature could potentially look at how are we going to impact the minimum wage amendment, because, for example, it isn't an immediate increase to $15 an hour this year. It's a gradual increase per the language's specific written detail. So right now it would go to $10 for next year, and then it would go up by $1 each year thereafter until we reach that $15 an hour in 2026.
Well, thank you for the clarification on that. One of our first questions, Joanna, is can we act to repeal the minimum wage amendment?
I think that, especially in a state like Florida, nothing is ever out of the question. And I think that with a legislature who is very concerned about our economic stability, that's certainly something that they will investigate and look into. But it is very difficult to take an amendment that the voters have passed by such a high number, a 60% number or above, and to do something that's opposite of the will of the voter. As a political leader, they have to evaluate the potential impacts that would have for them as leaders of their own parties. So I think it could be a difficult fight to undertake, for sure.
Yeah, and certainly if the legislature doesn't enact the amendment, there'll be lawsuits, right? There'll be litigation about that. And the other option is the people of Florida could vote to repeal the amendment. There could be an initiative to do that, but we haven't done that much in Florida. We did that for the bullet train that ran across the state. It was put in the Constitution and then it was taken out. It would take a lot of political capital, I think, at this point. And to Joanna's point, who's going to want to be on the other side of that politically when more than 60% of voters in Florida voted for this new $15 an hour minimum wage? So probably not getting repealed. Will be interesting to see how it gets implemented by the Florida legislature. I want to, we've gotten a bunch of questions in here, and I want to turn things over to my colleague, Ron Brisé. He's going to help us navigate these questions. But one of the questions that we got that maybe is a question that both Ron and Joanna can spend some time on is we had a extremely close Senate race in the battle for Senator JJR's Senate seat. Can either Joanna or Ron, can you speak to what happened in that race?
Sure, I'll kick it off. Go ahead, Joanna.
All right. So in that Senate race in particular, that is for District 37, and Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez from Miami was running for re-election. And he is down in his quest by about 21 votes, although I just saw a story pop up that said that the margin has decreased even further to 18 votes to Republican Ileana Garcia. And I think it is surprising to folks that that one has come so close. And what are the reasons behind that, especially if you look at the top of the ticket performance in that area, and how does that impact those local races? But that race in particular was one that Senate leadership on both sides spent a tremendous amount of money on. I believe the Republican Senate leadership spent a lot more than the Democrats probably did. But there was a lot of outside money that came into that race as well to heavily influence the vote. In addition to the fact that I think that this could be part of a small little bit of what people are liking to call a female wave or a pink wave, a preference for electing women that is certainly exciting to me. But I think that could be part of the answer there. And then I think also it just goes to turnout and who actually showed up to vote on the day of the election. And Ron, I'll turn it over to you now for your thoughts.
Sure. So just to add a little more to that, that district sort of falls in the same geographical space as the District 27, the Congressional District 27 and the 26th Congressional District. So it sits sort of in that general geographic area. And we saw that both of those districts lost. Both of those members, sitting members, lost to those sitting Democrat members, lost to incoming new Republican Congress members. So there's a couple of things that worked well, I think, in Miami-Dade County. The whole question about capitalism versus socialism, and that whole question there impacted anyone who was on the ballot that had Hispanic Americans, particularly Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans, that made up a large portion of their voting constituency. So I think that that played a very large role in the outcome of this election. And then, as we mentioned, the turnout was an issue in South Florida.
Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you, if I may,
Sure.
to run the rest of our questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. And thanks for your time today. All right. So here is an interesting question that that someone posed. Can anyone provide some insight as to how the passage of the Orange County Charter water rights may impact the state, even though the legislature made it illegal to do so? And so, Joanna, this may be closest to you, so let's see if you want to take that up at this time.
Sure. This is dealing with the so-called rights of nature issue. And in this past session, there was an omnibus bill that dealt with these particular issues, water and wastewater issues, really very focused on septic and sanitary sewer overflows. Is probably the biggest focus of the particular bill that passed, Senate Bill 712. But there was a portion of that bill that specifically prohibited the ability of these, environmental type ordinances from being passed. And so this is going to end up in a fight. I think this will probably culminate in a legal fight. And I think the folks that put this forward in the local area, knew that and felt as though they have a strong case for arguing that, the state has certainly their area that they regulate and oversee, but as a local government, if they want to go above and beyond what the state is requiring, then that is their right as voters to make those decisions. So it's going to be an interesting one, and I don't know if any of my other colleagues have thoughts on that, but that's sort of my perspective.
Thank you, Joanna. Kevin or Julie, any additional thoughts? If not, we can move on to the next question. So here's an interesting question, and it sort of leads back to Amendment 3 in terms of, and even if we look at the demographic shifts within our state in terms of registration. So I'm going to read the question. I am a fiscally conservative, responsible individual. At this time, neither the Democrats nor Republicans represent me, and I don't believe that I am alone. Feels like the parties are either hard left or hard right. Do you see that there may be room for a possible third party that can either be moderate Republican or moderate Democrat? And so I'm going to turn that over to you, Kevin, since you've been paying attention to some of the numbers and the registrations within our state.
Thank you, Representative. It's interesting. When I saw the original constitutional amendment, I found it very interesting, especially since the constitutional amendment went a step further than some other areas where it would be not only an open primary, but the top two winners would be actually the ones running. So you could have the potential of having two candidates from the same party to be able to run against each other, which would be a completely new concept. That's something that has not been seen in well over 50 years in certain areas. But with that being said, one of the items I find interesting is outside of a constitutional amendment, when you see voter registration numbers, you always see that you have the NPA or other independent votes that are registering. As of the last few election cycles, those numbers have slowed down, where going into 2008, you saw a significant increase in crossover of folks switching over from Republican to independent or Democrat to independent. that is slowed down. And I believe that speaks to what exactly is going on in our country and also in Florida with the divide in the paradigms that are being carried by voters right now. I think the realization of there being a third party, which, me speaking, I have always viewed third parties as nothing more than a potential to weaken one of the two primary parties, depending on what their desire is or what their political alignment is, whether it's closer to a conservative perspective or closer to a Democrat perspective. But with that being said, I think the biggest thing that's going to be important is making sure that both the Republican and Democratic Party start listening to their voters and understanding what they want and what they care about, and not what the party maybe has perceived as a norm. Right now, I think both parties really need to understand exactly what is driving turnout, because voters care, and that was shown in this election cycle. But whether you get a third party to become as competitive as the two-party system, I don't see that without a constitutional amendment, but we will have to wait and see. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Joanna or Julie, did either one of you want to add something? All right.
No, I agree that the parties, though, really need to listen to their constituents. I kind of agree with her. I believe that if somebody were to ask me if I was a Democrat or Republican, it would be hard for me to say one or the other, because I vote for the person. I go on and do my research on the candidates, and I agree. I feel like I'm kind of in the middle as well. So I am, registered Republican, but I can tell you that when you look at my ballot, you would not know that. So it is difficult, and I do hope the parties start listening to their constituents. I agree.
Excellent. All right. So here's another interesting question. It's going back to turnout, particularly in Miami-Dade County. Why weren't African Americans voters excited about Joe Biden when Barack Obama campaigned twice in Miami-Dade County for Joe? And so I guess I'll take that. So I think that there's a couple of things that factored in. One, I think the Biden campaign made a decision early on about how they were going to campaign. And so the door-to-door canvassing and all of those things weren't as aggressive as they probably would have been in other past elections. So that's one aspect there. And then you had less members of the legislature that were in active races in Miami-Dade County, at least Black members of the legislature who were in active races to help bring up and bring out voters to participate in the process. So I think that those were a couple of the dynamics. And then the other reality, I think anyone who's been around this process, that President Obama generally didn't have coattails, right? People voted for Obama because you either liked him or you voted against him. But generally, people didn't vote downline as a result of President Obama. So yes, it was great to have President Obama down in Miami-Dade County to try to energize folk. But the way they did it was a drive-in event. So you have a limited number of people who could show up at a driving event versus some of the rallies that happened in past elections, where you could then move people and encourage people to go directly to vote, depending on the time that you actually hosted the event and so forth. So I think that those are some of the factors, among others, that impacted how African Americans engaged in South Florida.
Ron.
Yes.
Question for you. What's your thoughts on the Biden campaign? Do you think they started too late in South Florida, whether it was for all minority voters down there, but for specifically Black and Hispanic. Do you think if they would have started earlier and, to your point, focus on their grassroots effort and their rallies in a way that was different than the COVID era, do you think that would have had a change in the numbers down in South Florida?
I think that that's a strong possibility that there would have been a marked difference in terms of turnout. You know, I was speaking to some of my friends who were in races, but they were not super competitive races. And so the amount of energy that they put forward and trying to be respectful of managing COVID and how they engage with voters and so forth played a major role in how those decisions were made. And certain communities react better to certain things. I will tell you from my personal experience when I ran in South Florida, you know, when we were running in the primaries or even in the general election, the whole time of early voting, we had vehicles available and we were running a phone operation that we would call people and basically fish them out to come to vote. And so, you know, we make sure that the person, if they needed a ride, there was availability for that and all those type of things. And those type of operations, I don't think were happening at the same rate this go around as it did in past elections. There is a final question before we go into concluding comments. And this is around Amendment 4. And so can we please explain Amendment 4 a little bit more and propose changes, considering that it might be back?
And so Amendment 4, this was the constitutional amendment that was for voter approval. It's my understanding that this was to require a constitutional amendment to be passed and placed on the Constitution. You would have to have it heard and voted in approval of over 60% in 2 consecutive election cycles. That is a significant change. Currently, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, there's a 60% vote approval rating for all constitutional amendments. This would simply require it to be approved twice in consecutive election cycles, which is something that conservatives view as important and others may view as limiting their ability to affect change outside of the legislature.
Yeah, this was one that was really pushed by the Florida Chamber, but you also have to look at the cost of doing this, the advertising cost. And so if you pass once and you get 70%, say, and then you have to go again, you know, to go on and advertise to get it passed the second time is a you know, a big cost. So I say that it will be back, and I think that it probably will. I know that the chamber is behind it, but you know, with 40, like Senator LeMieux said, with 47.5%, maybe they'll look at this as something that we're just not ready for yet.
I would also add that I think there's a contingent of folks that would really like to see an amendment that does away with the whole Constitutional Revision Commission and its process just outright, and the way that we amend our state constitution. So this was probably a way they felt that they could possibly affect a change without a complete abolishment of that institution. But I know there are a lot of folks that are very displeased with the way that we have been impacting our Constitution.
All right, thank you. And just my thoughts on that question. So I believe that Amendment 4, there's a couple different ways to look at it. One is, as you all have mentioned, that protecting the Constitution is extremely important. The second component is the contrary view to that is if that citizens have fought to put something on the Constitution, and if it's gone through, why should it be second guessed and have to go through that process a second time, particularly if it's truly a citizens group? So that's going to be an area of open discussion over the next couple of years, as I believe, as many of you do, that this question in itself is one that is likely to come back again. And so to wrap it up, I want to thank my colleagues for all of their engagement this morning, and thank you, the audience, for your participation and your questions today. And if we didn't get to all of your questions, we certainly apologize. And feel free to send us the questions, and we'll respond to them via email. And we hope we can answer your questions satisfactorily. This election was truly exciting. It is still going on. They're still counting votes as we speak. You know, there's several states that are still outstanding, 5 to be exact. And so there may be some progress by tonight, and we'll see. But we know that this legislative session that is going to begin shortly after organizational session, and we go into session next year, is going to be one that is going to be very consequential, considering the effects of COVID on the economy, the effects of COVID on the budget, and all of the things surrounded and associated to that. And so thank you for your time today. And if you want to share this with your friends and colleagues, you can tell them that they can come to our website at the Gunster website, gunster.com. They can come visit us tomorrow on our website, and they'll have access to this broadcast or this webinar for their viewing at their leisure. And for all of your legal needs and for your government affair needs, feel free to contact anyone on our team. Thank you very much. And we look forward to serving you in the future.